Good morning, everyone. I am Rupi Rai, PPP consultant based in Washington, D.C. I'm joining today from Berlin, Germany, and welcome. I'll be your moderator for this webinar today in the PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa series. Today's topic is the framework for managing fiscal commitments and contingent liabilities for PPPs in Kenya. And this is the fourth webinar in this webinar series. The series is hosted jointly by the Open Learning Campus, the PPP Unit Kenya, and the World Bank PPP Group. In today's webinar, we will discuss PPPs and their impact on a government's balance sheets. We will look at the framework that Kenya developed to manage fiscal commitments, and we will discuss the framework's implications for Kenya's PPP program. Now, why is this topic important? Kenya's PPP Act of 2013 requires every PPP project to be assessed for its impact on the government's balance sheets. And this assessment is to take place either at the feasibility stage, where following the completion of negotiations with bidders, and it should also take place at any point during a project when amendments or modifications to the contract are made, and if they might impact the government's fiscal exposure. Based on this legal mandate and the requirement to assess PPP's impact on the government and its books, the government of Kenya decided to create the Fiscal Commitment and Contingent Liabilities Management Framework. And this is what we will be talking about today. The Public Debt Management Office, the PDMO, has been a key driver of this process. And it should also be noted that Kenya is among the first lower middle income economies to develop such a framework. And we'll discuss not only the framework today, but also how it was developed, the implementation, and also the implications on Kenya's PPP program. Today's presenter is from the Public Debt Management Office in the National Treasury of Kenya, Mr. Wahoro Ndoho. He's the Director General at the PDMO, and he's joining us from Nairobi today. Wahoro has over 8 years of experience in the public sector. He has worked for the last 5 years in public finance management and he has had senior management roles in the state government treasury of New South Wales in Australia, and also he was a manager in the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In his current role, he's responsible for advisory and policy implementation support, operational oversight, and public debt management review. Wahoro holds an MBA from the Australian Graduate School of Management and a bachelor's degree from the University of Canberra. Welcome, Wahoro. It's great to have you here. Our discussants today, we have two discussants, are Hadija Diba. Hadija will be joining us shortly with Wahoro in Nairobi. Hadija was actually our first speaker in this webinar series, and I can see her. She's here. Hi, Hadija. And welcome. Hadija is a consultant and PPP advisor for the World Bank Group, and she's also a certified project finance specialist with the Institute of Public-Private Partnerships. For the past 4 years, she has been part of the World Bank's Infrastructure and Public-Private Partnerships project as a financial modeler, and she holds a master's degree in project planning and management, as well as a bachelor's degree from the University of Nairobi and University of Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture. Welcome. Our second discussant today is joining from Washington, D.C. It's Shyamala Shukla, Senior Public-Private Partnerships Specialist at the World Bank Group. Shyamala has worked at the World Bank Group for the past 6 years as a consultant and also as an advisor to the executive director. Shyamala has over 2 decades of experience in infrastructure financing and infrastructure policy and government support instruments, among others. She has worked closely with the government of India on the development and implementation of infrastructure and PPP policy. And she's worked on a number of projects in countries including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Ghana, Kenya, and Sri Lanka and Vietnam. She has an MPA from Harvard and a master's in finance from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Shyamala. Today's agenda is that we'll start with Wahoro's presentation, which will take about 20 to 25 minutes. We will then follow with remarks by Hadija and Shyamala for about 10-15 minutes. And as always, we encourage you to send us questions via the chat. We have time allocated for a Q&A session following the presentations and the remarks. So please send them to us as a question comes up. And with this introduction, I will hand it over to Wahoro.
Yes, a quick presentation on on the fiscal competence and contingent liability. Maybe just a quick brief background to this. The setting for the development of the FCCL management framework stands within the context of a much wider look at how government approached risk and the extent to which risk plays a key role in decision making. And it is not by surprise or by mistake that it seems that the first place that this coagulated into a tangible proposition was in the PPP space. This is because, as part of government's efforts to diversify its funding arrangements for its infrastructure projects, it became clear that we would have to get quite innovative in how we could go about seeking new ways and new methods for financing our infrastructure gap. The infrastructure gap is estimated about $4 billion a year. And this is, for those of you who may have a history of Kenya, we've had a period in our past where we, in a sense, didn't quite invest in our infrastructure as we should. And so there's a fair bit of catch-up. And so one of the issues that came up was, if you're going to fund the infrastructure gap, then it would be important for us to look for new ways of funding it. And one of them that was proposed and fairly quickly concretized was the use of PPPs. And so in that context, it is in that context that the issues that we are about to talk about fall, and within which we can, in a sense, it will inform how this project goes forward. So the framework for the management of fiscal commitments and contingent liabilities in Kenya currently is firmly based on PPPs. And maybe to just go quickly, for those of you who can see my slides, let me just move this. Let's start with why FCCL. Why did we need to create this management framework? Essentially to ensure that PPP projects and the risks thereof to government were identified, they were justified, quantified, provisioned for, mitigated for, and thereafter. It was important for the government to be in a place where we have a fairly detailed and best way to put it is a scientific method for ensuring we're able to measure risk, as I said, and to provide for it. And so in doing that, the framework was established, and it's basically made up of two parts. There's an FCCL guidelines, which is basically, an FCCL guidelines component, and what we call a technical manual, which is a far more detailed document. These two together make up the FCCL management framework. The FCCL guidelines in themselves are really a summary of the technical guidance manual and give a higher level description of the assessment approval of PPPs. It is, in a sense, a quick reference section of the framework. And then the second part is the technical manual, goes to a lot more detail about the how to quantify risks. And we showcase examples, and we also use it to give as much guidance as possible to technical officials, particularly analysts, on how to go about measuring or addressing the issues of quantifying risk. From that, the objectives of the framework were basically 5. Actually, there's a 6th one, but I'll come back to that. The first was to institutionalize the whole FCCL process in our ministries or any government entity that enters into a PPP. By institutionalizing that, we mean that we wanted to embed the FCCL process, or we are aimed to embed the FCCL process in every project that a government entity gets involved in. It's particularly important because our role in the Treasury is one of review. So most of the work happens in the ministries, and the extent to which they need to know how to do it and to conduct it. Then it became necessary for us to create this management framework. Second is, of course, to ensure compliance with the law, the PPP Act 2013, and also the FCCL policy that emanates from that. This is because there are legal requirements for entities, government entities, to comply with the Act. And the Act is fairly specific in what it lays down as requirements for how risk is captured. In fact, a requirement that they must quantify this risk. They must take that into consideration as part of the approval process. And as I think Rupi mentioned earlier, it happens at two levels, both which I'll come to in a minute. A third objective was to ensure a whole of government FCCL perspective on PPPs. This is particularly important because we are now in a devolved system of government. So we have essentially 48 governments in Kenya. We have the national government and then 47 county governments. Now, for obvious reasons, you want everyone to be singing from the same hymn book. And so it became clear that unless we have one framework, we're going to have major problems. Not to say we've achieved it, but at least it gives everyone a common reference point of how to go about doing their assessments for PPP projects. Another one was, of course, to standardize how contingent liabilities are derived. This is particularly interesting because it is, in a sense, a first for us to in a sense, create as much as possible a scientific and predictable and systematic way of measuring our FCCL liabilities. And contingent liabilities is particularly important because I think one could say that it's always my view that contingent liabilities is a bit like a Titanic's iceberg. The bit receives the depth, but the contingent liability is what often becomes the undoing of governments. Another one is to ensure that government risk exposure for PPPs was, as I said in the first slide, identified, quantified, and managed. This is critical because once the exercise has been done to identify these risks, we have to make sure that there is a process by which the government only takes that risk for which it is capable of, it is able to manage. And so the FCCA framework gave us a good instrument to enable that to happen. It is also particularly important in ensuring that once the quantification has happened, that thereafter there is a process by which that then continues to be managed. It's one thing to get it right the first time when you're setting it up, but you need the discipline to ensure that we continue to manage those risks we've identified and quantified. Now, the application of the FCCL framework has several components to it. One is that it's mandatory. It's mandatory for all government entities, including county governments. This, as I said, because it's a common standard, it is a way to ensure that we all are doing the same thing the same way. Second was also to inform the issuance of letters of support or other instruments of support that the government gives to the private sector to encourage more investment in PPP projects. A third application of the FCCA framework is to ensure there's some adaptability to the changes in the PPP program. The program itself is fairly less ambitious, is maybe to put it mildly. Kenya has an extremely ambitious PPP agenda for the reason that we think that the private sector, by and large, should play a leading role in provision of infrastructure, for the simple reason that it is the biggest sector of any economy. I think often it's mistaken that it's the government sector that's the biggest, but even the government sector derives its resources from the private sector through taxes. So by having this management framework, it would ensure that it's also adaptable. And by that I mean that the FCCA framework is a living document, dynamic. We expect it to adapt to the changes, but at least it gives us a base to start from. And that is what, and so its application we foresee will be one that will adapt to the changes as Kenya grows in this space. And of course, finally, it enables the evaluation of ongoing PPP projects that may not have previously been assessed for FCCL. To a large extent, we've done that, but mainly in the energy sector. But as we perfect methodologies and and how we apply them, then we expect that to refine and improve our assessment of current projects that have not yet been assessed for FCCF. So the FCCF framework operates in a fairly structured manner. The key document in this framework is the feasibility study. Essentially, the feasibility study is the government entity's view of how a government function can be carried out by the private sector. And so it's expected that this is a document where the government entity has done extremely detailed and robust analysis of how a function that they are currently being delivered by government can be given or can be partnered with a private sector entity in a way that ensures that the risks, most of the risks that are normally attributable to the private sector are allocated there, and the government takes only what it is. It is its own. It has three components, of course: the technical option, just assessing the feasibility study on a technical level for all the issues regarding, for example, if it's roads, that it is robust and it is, as far as the engineering is concerned, is done to spec. We've also got so we've got two others, which is a procurement option. Now this is it tests whether of all the procurement methods that are available to the government entity, that the PPP option is the one that is best suited for delivering a particular government function. And it's not enough to have identified the PPP option as the best option, but even among the PPP options, which among them is the most ideal to deliver the particular function. So in that role, the role of my Directorate of Public Debt Management Office is to really ensure several things. That it's viable, and viable is a large phrase. It's a big phrase, basically to tick off certain elements. One, that the project is affordable. The fact that the project is value for money. And by this we normally mean just that compared to what would normally be the government method, which is the traditional procurement, there's a demonstrable net positive benefit from using the PPP way. And also another important part of this is what as a key instrument, I'll come to call the project risk matrix. And this is essential to ensure that all the risks have been identified and, as I've said, quantified, justified, mitigated and managed. And essential to give government a clear view of all the risks anticipated, the key risks anticipated in a project, and that to ensure that these have been quantified sufficiently for government to go into this partnership with a very clear view of the risk allocation between the two parties. It is particularly important for us in the context of ensuring that the government entity has made provisions for the likelihood of a risk eventuating. And in this, the framework envisages the government entity, being able to quantify, maybe in the next, let's over the term of a project's term over, let's say, 10 years, that given its own detailed analysis of statistical probability using either probabilistic methodology or any methodology that is able to justify both identification of the risk but its quantification, that the entity itself has made provisions in its budget to meet that contingency. As you can imagine, it's a fairly complex conversation, and one we are only just beginning to get a handle of. And in the middle of all of this, it's important to also note that this feasibility study and how government entities do this is with the help of specialist advisors who are expected to, having had a lot of experience in this, to assist the government entity to do that and to do it well. So in that context, therefore, the FCCF framework gives, for lack of a better word, an arena, and maybe should say a structure of analysis that helps government entities to conduct a feasibility FCCL analysis in a rigorous and structured manner. Now, in terms of our own internal institutional arrangement vis-a-vis the management framework, it's essentially, it works as a partnership between the PPP unit, which is also a unit within the National Treasury, and my Directorate of Public Debt Management Office, to ensure that we're able to deliver the FCCL framework. For the PPP unit, its responsibilities revolve mainly around supporting and facilitating what is known as the PPP Committee, which has been established by law as a supreme PPP authority, to which the PPPU then provides support and facilitation to, because that's a committee that makes the decisions on whether a project goes forward or not. And so even FCCL, the FCCL review is part of that much bigger process of approving projects for funding, for financing under PPP. It's also PPPU's role to support contracting authorities and facilitate them in the process of securing PPP projects. And a lot can be said just on that space alone, maybe for another day. And of course, the final function of the PPP unit is operationalizing the Act, and with it, the attendance regulations. I think it's a particularly massive undertaking, because one has to appreciate that this is a new concept that's brought to what has been a fairly traditional paradigm of how to go about securing or developing an infrastructure. And so to a large extent, the PPP unit has had a fairly, shall we call, heavy responsibility of actualizing, operationalizing the PPP Act. And for that reason, it's also the resident experts on how the PPP Act actually evolves and is applied by government. For my part, in our department, we have what used to be actually first was set up as the FCCL unit that focused primarily on PPPs. But as a consequence of the questions around a risk-based approach in how government finances projects, the unit then had a much larger mandate, where then we were basically required now to look at a whole of government perspective. And so now that unit has morphed into what we call the Financial and Risk Management Unit, that looks after not only PPPs, but also asks hard questions across the whole of government. Some of the areas we are involved, some of the key parts of this operationalizing the FCCL across beyond just PPPs is the use of the FCCL management frameworks tools. We'll come to those. There's a few tools we use that can help us in this process. The second key one is really the issue of disclosure reporting and data information management. These are all fairly new, and we are in the process of building our capacity to do that. Other things we are doing, of course, is training, and not training in the context of FCCL, but a lot broader. And also a key part of our function is liaising and working closely with other Treasury departments, both in the FCCL management review, but more broadly in the context of sensitizing all departments, especially both within the Treasury and without, on the importance of a risk-based approach to financial management. Now, the FCCL assessment is essentially the part we play in the PDMO is really on two levels. It's a four-part. The approval of a PPP project goes through fairly clear stages by the PPP Act, Kenya's PPP Act of 2013. There's a project proposal that's submitted. Then there's a feasibility study that from which the government entity submits to us that includes the assessment of what is assessed to be the risks attached to a particular project. And it's at this is thinking particularly of political risk. Some measure of force majeure, though that is always debatable. And the second part is that the quantification of this risk is one that has gone through a process that is rigorous and defensible, because it is key to a lot of the financial planning that goes thereafter. And so it's in this stage also that, for example, the use of the financial model that has been developed to support a project is scrutinized to see whether it makes financial sense. Secondly, whether it has captured all the risks that have been identified in the project risk matrix, but also clearly that whether the ministry or the government entity has made provisions or is planning to make provisions to meet the risks that might eventuate from a project. Remember, at the end of the day, a project must be bankable. In other words, it must make commercial sense in its own right. And the extent to which it doesn't do that, if the reason for that lack of commercial viability is because of aspects of the project or the location or something about the project is put that we identify to be the government's responsibility, then the whole PPP framework is also about the government stepping in to at least take the risks that would make a project unviable, provided they are the ones that are defined. And I've mentioned particularly political risk, which is, and even political risks can be provided for through other types of insurance anyway. So those are two parts of the process for assessing PPP projects. The next one is an evaluation process that happens. Now this goes back to the PPP unit. And after we have given our view regarding whether or not we feel that the FCCA risks that have been identified have been adequately treated, then the evaluation process is one that creates the momentum for the entity, the government entity, then going out to market to get the private sector to now bid for the project. At the point where the private sector then comes back and says, yes, we would like to do the project, this is a proposal, they will tend to come with the financial model of their own. That now, this second financial model is one that assesses what the market's view of the project and the risks thereof. And it's at this point that the PDMO also comes in again, and we then compare. One of our rules is to compare whether our initial assessment and this assessment that's now market sourced tally or they are aligned. And if they're not, then the reasons why they're not aligned. And then if the disparity is too large, then a lot of hard questions will need to be asked, including whether there's optimism bias as far as the government entity is concerned. But it's a learning process, and from that we hope to get ever better at ensuring that ultimately the feasibility study financial estimate of the project and what you get back for the market will hopefully converge as we perfect our systems. Currently, we've had some interesting situations where when it's come back from the market, the quantum of difference is an order of magnitude that I suppose at the end of the day, even that shows the need for a rigorous risk management and assessment process. Because we've had these instances where the assessment coming back to us has been way too, has had no resemblance to the feasibility study. And I suppose then that becomes a learning opportunity for everyone. But we foresee the two of them converging as we grow our expertise in this space. Let me also just quickly note that sometimes when, even after the second assessment has been done, and remember that after the first assessment, if we are happy with at least our part of the FCCL assessment, the entity can then go seek a partner, a private sector partner. And if after the second assessment we are happy, they can go into commercial close. They can close the projects, close the deal as far as the commercial close of the project. In other words, there's an agreement now between the entity and the private sector partner to proceed to explore now implementing the project. After our second assessment, and we've given a view as far as whether we think there's still alignment between the two, that then triggers what to give an opportunity for the private sector entity to now proceed to seek a financial close. And that's an interesting one, because usually when you go for financial close, you will then get back the financing partners coming into the game, and that then creates another conversation. And so suffice it to say that our role as a FCCL in the PDMO is always to be involved if there's any material change that's of a financial nature that would change the terms of the original agreement. And so to some extent, even after the second part, when we've done a financial close, we are in a place where by law actually, we are expected to look at if there's any change, material change to the financial dynamics of that project, for which the finances change, and therefore we need to again assess and still make a judgment as to whether the project is still viable and should go forward. Finally, just very quickly, there are 2 or 3 tools of the FCCL management framework which we use. The first one is the project risk matrix. Our second one is a long-term fiscal planning tool. Now, of course, we've mentioned, of course, you have to have very strong, quantitatively competent staff, and in the process of recruiting that. I was going to mention that another tool is really one that is prepared by the government entity, and that is a financial model. And it's hard to overemphasize the importance of that, because that's a basis really of the financial viability of a project. Now, quickly on the financial project risk matrix, essentially just ensures that risks are allocated equitably between public and private parties. It also quantifies the liabilities associated with the recommended project configuration. It proposes how these liabilities shall be managed. It aggregates the budget funding requirements. This is particularly true where we have identified the risks, and to some extent you can quantify and say that if this risk occurs, this is the likely implications, financial implications for it. And it is also a tool that consists of an expert assessment of the probability, timing, and impact of the risk events. For each of the key identified risks that have been submitted by the government entity. We cannot overemphasize this, because this is really where, for us, for lack of capacity, our own lack of capacity, we've had to use and incorporate the use of technical experts to assist the government entity to do this process well. And of course, the project risk matrix is intimately linked to the financial model. I've then got a copy here. I don't know if you can see it of our project risk matrix and how it's used. In terms of a quick anecdote on this, we have had at least about a couple of entities that had no idea about how to use this, but the very process of walking them through it and showing them how it works created such a dynamic conversation about how risk should be managed generally, quite apart from just PPP projects. And so in a sense, it's been a very powerful tool for also to illustrating to senior management the need to have a very strong risk-based approach to a lot of decision making. The challenges and opportunities for project risk matrix, there's a few. One is that it needs a very strong information support base. for it by way of extensive and well populated databases, especially with quantitative data. Another challenge is, of course, the one we are still encountering, that's institutional systemic capacity constraints, both in terms of just the hardware, which we are investing heavily in, but also the software in terms of training for capacity in our staff to do. Now, opportunities of this, of course, as I mentioned, is one is that it has helped a general reorientation towards a risk-based approach across what I'd call the non-PPP space, and that's been a good thing. It's been a good tool for that. Yeah, and it's probably improved our. I know it has improved our decision making because we do ask hard questions, especially as we begin to implement a more quantitative analytical method to how decisions are made. The long-term fiscal planning tool, let me just say for this one that the purpose of this is really to introduce a new paradigm where as a government we then are have required our officers to start looking at the whole project life cycle the whole life cycle cost of a project, and not just the hard costs that can be quantified and seen now. And that has been particularly powerful because it's meant that then we are providing we are applying long-term budgeting to our projects beyond the normal budget cycle. And that has been a conversation that's continuing because it's a significant shift, a paradigm shift for a lot of our officers. Let me just quickly jump to a financial.
Waharo,
Yes.
sorry, just to quickly interject here, we're running a little over time, so if you could just close maybe in a minute or so we can move on to the commentators. Thank you.
All right. I'll just finish essentially by, let me see if I can get this. Yeah. I'll just finish by saying that there's been some interesting benefits from FCCL. And maybe the most important ones have been, quite apart from improving or raising the profile of a risk-based approach, it has been how it has fed into instruments of risk management across government. I think particularly in terms of the letters of support, and then in terms of instrument for government support for private sector investment. It's been particularly useful for that because it's given a very structured method for doing that. Finally, it is brought a significant increase in the rigor of analysis and an appreciation that the life cycle costs should really apply to all projects, not just PPP projects. And so going forward, I think these are some of the legacies of this management framework. And in the long term, I envisage it covering a lot more than just PPPs. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Khadija?
Thank you, Vahoro. Let's just continue straight away with Hadija. Hadija, if you could summarize your remarks on this, maybe for like 5 minutes or something, so we can continue with Shyamala and the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Rupi. And thank you also to Vahoro for that very detailed presentation. I'm sure that he would have wished to have more time on this, but a copy of it will definitely be shared by our World Bank colleagues. A key feature of PPP projects is the fact that it lies around risk allocation. And that risk allocation, as emphasized within the Kenya's PPP Act, requires that optimality in the allocation between the private and public sector. Because while from a public sector's perspective, it could be seen that us engaging with the private sector, it's all about transferring all risk to the private sector. But PPP is about partnership. And that partnership requires close interrogation on what the private sector and what the public sector takes. The whole philosophy of risk allocation is allocate risk to the party best able to not only influence the outcome of it, but be in a better position of managing or mitigating the risk when it does occur. The PPP Act requires that key question on risk allocation, optimality in risk allocation, is answered prior to market engagement. The FCCL management framework supports the public debt management in answering on behalf of the government. And not only does it answer the question of is this affordable in a long-term perspective, because PPPs bear that characteristic of having a long-term nature in it, but is it also affordable to the end user? Because if a project requires that government steps in providing fiscal commitment, which is this direct liability, it requires government to have that figure upfront so as to be able to pay for it when the obligation arises. Contingent liability, on the other hand, is a complex issue. The uncertainty about the magnitude of that event and the timing of it prevents a challenge for the public debt management unit as to how do we quantify this and how do we mitigate for it. So the FCCL management framework supports the PDMO in trying to, for the first year, to sort of accommodate a face value figure, but then build the capacity of our government officials in doing a probabilistic calculation of this, because that estimation is important to support taking on board future obligations, future government commitments. What I'm doing currently at the World Bank is trying to create a county government program, PPP program. Wahora mentioned that we have 47 county governments. Now, if I do a very good job, we will have 47 PPP projects, hopefully in the next coming years. 47 PPP projects, and aside from the fact that most of them will be social in nature, so fiscal commitment is a live issue, contingent liability is also a bigger issue. And we will work very closely with Wahora's office in trying to create a capping effect, because you cannot necessarily allow so much of an obligation to be taken on board on government's book as regards giving that comfort to the private sector. I would wish to stop there so as to give an opportunity to Shamna also, and I'll be quite happy, Rupi, to take any questions.
Thank you, Adija. Thank you, Vahoro, for an excellent presentation. And I'll just touch upon quickly, on 5 key points that I see which are important for a risk management framework or an FCCL management framework, to be more precise. Many of these Vahoro has brought out in his presentation. I would say begin to look at FCCL management framework as from the point of view of a whole life perspective. When you look at the project point of view, it begins very early from the stage when you're conceiving a project and before development stage, where you're looking at the high level figures which are related to a project, the kind of services that you're going to provide through this PPP. That whole of life perspective is very important. It starts when you are you start thinking about a project, and FCCL management ends the day the assets are handed over, if it is that kind of PPP, to back to the government. So it's a process which builds, which you have to keep looking at throughout. And the second point I would like to talk about is that you have to look at risk at 4 or 5 levels, not just one project, because the government has a wider perspective. And when I talk about this, why do I see risk at 4 or 5 levels? Risk is dynamic, as you know. The project changes as you get to a milestone. Some risks drop out from your risk matrix, some others come in, and therefore the project profile is changing. And while the project profile is changing, and while you are looking at risk from the project point of view, you have 2 other areas where you have to look at. One is the sector exposure of the government. So the sector perspective comes in. As projects change, your sector perspective changes. What do you have in terms of exposure in transport? What do you have in terms of exposure in some other sector? And then the third perspective comes in, your entire aggregate PPP portfolio. And it doesn't stop here. You have to look at that. How much exposed are you as a government from all of these projects put together as an aggregate? And then your other perspective comes in, which is the 4th level, and that is, what does your government look like in terms of your different debt, your different liabilities, which might be non-PPP liabilities, non-PPP, commitments. What does that look like? So all of these perspectives are very important in your FCCL framework, and Kenya is doing all of that. In fact, Kenya looks at it from the perspective of putting the PPP exposure in its annual debt statement and looking at it at a much larger level. Now, the problem is that there are questions on the chat box which I see where people have been asking questions from the accounting perspective. So I would like to go, beyond the risk and come to this, risk projects and your exposure from the risk perspective and the accounting perspective. And we often see that governments with more mature PPP programs have been looking at FCCL from the accounting perspective. Kenya has not yet got there. And it's very important for Kenya and countries like Kenya, lots of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, even other countries outside in Asia, which are beginning their PPP programs, which might have a large portfolio of projects, but they have not yet reached that level of maturity in terms of their governance systems. They have to look at the risk perspective, which Uhuru has gone through in detail now. So for the next stage for Kenya would be how to, take all of these numbers and start making that appear in its, accounting systems. That is something which Kenya has not yet come to, but it is going to come there. Another lesson which I feel we see very clearly from the Kenyan experience is institutionalize, and Buhuru has referred to that also, institutionalize everywhere. And it's not just building a unit or building people or skills within the government to do this work. It's also important that your FCCL framework is seamlessly intertwined or included in your general PPP processes, so that it's not something which runs parallel, for which you have to spend extra time, but which looks at your exposure as government from the perspective of risk of the project and is totally intertwined into your risk management processes. The last point I would say is from the Kenyan experience, a direct, what we see is that it's easier to build institutions when there's a legislative mandate, as in the case of Kenya. So it is important for us to think of building the requirement for an FCCL framework into your legislation, into your regulations. And the second thing that we saw, and which is very stark here, is it's less easy to build user-friendly models to do this. And we are still grappling with that on the part of the World Bank and the Kenyan government and many other governments we are working with. So it's less easy to build user-friendly models. It's less easy to do a proper evaluation. And it's also less easy to come to an aggregate figure of what your FCCL looks like, given that you have so many projects, and many times the government doesn't have the full information, especially on IPPs and other energy projects that have been there for a long time. So the Kenyan government is strong in the sense that it has collected over the last couple of years all the information and all the FCCL exposure that is happening from existing projects that went before, for example, 13 to 14 IPPs. That's about it, and I hope you have enjoyed this, and please keep asking your questions.
Thank you very much, Wohoro, Hadija, and Shyama. We've been receiving a lot of questions on different topics, on really the structure of the FCCL, on risk, fiscal reporting, contingent liabilities. Let's start with a question that was asked towards the end by Tendai. Tendai would like to know, how does the government account for contingent liabilities arising from government guarantees for debt incurred by state-owned enterprises or joint ventures with SOEs implementing PPP projects? That's a question on contingent liabilities. And also, maybe you could also talk about if there is a mechanism to have government funds, liquid assets that can be mobilized actually in the event that contingent liabilities are realized in Kenya.
Okay.
Whoever would like to take the question, Wohoro, Hadija.
Yeah, maybe, let me start with the second one. The short answer is no, we don't have a mechanism right now for mobilizing liquidity. We do have a provision in the law, though, for creating a sinking fund, and it is something we're contemplating right now in the context of not just contingent liability, but across the debt management space. Secondly, is that with the mobilization of part of our challenge may be the wrong word. Yeah, well, that's a challenge. Is that there's a lot, we've been on an extremely steep learning curve, and for a lot of these issues regarding how risk is managed, one of the key challenges for us has been to just create the right mix and could I call it a team, a seed team that has the rigor to be able to do this analysis to the degree required. I would say that in the next year, maybe even less, we will have more robust methods around how to provide for this beyond just the the consolidated fund.
Ruby, if I may add a bit onto what Wohoro has mentioned, Tendai's question, if I may read it again, was how does the government account for contingent liabilities arising from government guarantees for debt incurred by SOEs implementing PPPs or those SPVs working on PPPs? As I mentioned earlier, contingent liability is still a very complex issue because the first thing we know, yes, it's a risk, but whether it will materialize or not is a debate, right? We know that the risk will happen. But then once it happens, we're not necessarily sure of the quantum till it happens. And that presents a challenge to governments as regards how do we then provide that liquidity provision because we're not sure of the figure and we're not sure when it will happen. The PPP Act in particular trying to deal with PPP contingent liabilities has provided for a PPP project facilitation fund. And this is a multi-purpose fund for which one window of that fund is to provide liquidity provisions for contingent liabilities that have arisen. Because we wish to create a sustainable PPP program in the sense that should one contingent liability arise, it will not affect the entire PPP program because the private sector get confidence in understanding that a country has a program behind its PPP agenda. It's not a one-off topic by the government. In doing so, the PFF, the Project Facilitation Fund, the sources of money is from the government itself. That's a priority. But then we're also leveraging the fact that Kenya has lots of development partners who are interested in supporting the PPP program. World Bank in particular being at the forefront. And the National Treasury, with the support of Wohoro's department and the PPP unit, is engaging with those development partners in trying to build that particular window of that fund in the event that we have PPP projects whose contingent liabilities arise, in particular in the IPP sector for which Kenya has a very rich history. So there is a framework that is able to try to quantify to the best possible level what that figure might look like. And then there is a fund which is currently being operationalized. There is regulations already been drafted, it is with the Attorney General's office, in trying to create that fund and have it up and running.
Maybe to just add quickly on that, there's also the requirement that government entities would factor that into their budgets. Now, the extent to which they are able or not able to do that is part of the learning curve that we're going through now. Because it is expected that when a government entity comes to us and says, yes, everything is, we are happy with that, you've done your analysis, you've identified the risks in the future. A question that we'll be asking is what sort of provisionings have you made in your budget, in the long-term budget for that project towards this? Now, it may be that those funds are then maybe put into PFF fund or elsewhere. But remember that the entity itself is also expected to have thought through the risk issues and made some major provisions for those risks. Maybe not in full, but at least to have demonstrated that they have set aside funding for it.
Thank you, Wohoro and Hadija. Shyamala, would you like to add anything to the comments?
Yeah. It's the government of Kenya has had this, to add to what Wohoro has been saying, the government of Kenya has had in the past to make a couple of payments, which is quite less actually, looking at the fact that it has been doing PPPs and IPPs for a long time and had some challenging regional projects also. However, the Public Financial Management Act provides for payment which arises from some of these guarantees being called, and you can always go to the contingency fund of any government to quickly pay and then make adjustments in your budgetary estimates later on. So this provision is always there within governments. However, it's important, as Wohoro pointed out, to have some backup funds, and we have examples from, say, Colombia, which backs up each of its projects with little funds. That was the case a few years ago. And some other governments are also using their sovereign wealth funds as a backup in case it has to be made. So there are various ways of doing it, and we look forward to the institutionalization of this, the PFF window that Uhuru spoke about, and how it will work in the future. So it remains to be seen how these can be variously used. But right now, every government has the provision to pay immediately before making budgetary provisions.
Thank you, Shyamala. We've received a few questions. Some of them were already addressed about fiscal reporting and how this can be improved, especially in the context of disclosure. And Shyamala talked about it a little bit. But Wahora and Hadija, maybe you could also elaborate a little more on what you said earlier, that more can be done. You're trying to do more capacity building within the FCCL unit to improve monitoring of government liabilities, to make sure that they're disclosed in relevant forums. Just maybe adding to what Shyamala suggested, what else do you think needs to be done on that front?
Maybe I could just set the context there in that the government,
Maybe Wahora,
there is a... Can you hear me?
Could you talk a little bit about how you have done a very good section in your annual debt statement, and I remember that what you presented was also kind of applauded by the IMF on good presentation of your PPP contingent liabilities. So maybe could you talk a little bit about how you presented your section on PPPs in your statement, the statement.
Well, yes. I was actually coming to that. What I was going to say is that we have a very strong government reporting framework now in place that requires, it's really mandatory reporting on all aspects of financial management in government. And this is legislatively and constitutionally we are required to do. Now, as to whether our systems have been up to it has been the big challenge. But what Shyamala is referring to was, as part of our annual, we've got two reports that the PDMO produces every year. It's the annual debt report and the medium-term debt strategy reports, which are mandated by legislation for production every year. And in the last year, we got to include a report for the annual debt statement on our assessment at that point in time. It was fairly, well, it's the best we could do at the time, but we were able to capture what we estimated would be our commitments as far as contingent liability was concerned. But what was particularly interesting for us was that in medium-term debt strategy, we were also asked to start anticipating what sort of commitments we would have. And in fact, I would say, like, for this coming year, we are actually in the process of compiling our medium-term debt strategy. One of the things that we are looking to do is to anticipate. And you may not always be able to give quantums for everything. What we'll be doing is we'll be at least flagging some of the key areas of contingent liability. And this is really to comply with the law. And now, from what also again, Shyamala, you were referring to, let me just say that it was interesting that I probably got more inquiries after IMF, after the comments that came from the IMF and the World Bank, that in some ways it helps. What's the word? Sometimes when you're doing work, it's hard to it's good to get feedback. Sometimes in our work, we just put our head down and work, and you're not always cognizant of what we are doing now is impacting others. And so we appreciated the recognition. I think it was a good outcome, because it helped me then reinforce the need to do it even more for this year and going forward. Now, so just quickly before I finish, we have a department, in fact, a directorate in the National Treasury called the Accounting Services and Quality Assurance Directorate. And they have got a very strong, they are really the key directorate that pushes government reporting. And so as a consequence of this mandate also, the expectations now are not just for internal in terms of the PDMO driving the reporting, but you also have an external entity, well, within the Treasury, that also expects us to report. And so there's a sense in which it's not only, they're not only push factors, but also pull factors to ensure that we improve and increase our reporting. It's particularly true so also because at the moment we're also in the process of reviewing our financial markets reforms. We are carrying out some financial market reforms, and key among those, of course, is disclosure. And so the whole reporting and disclosure element of all reporting, I think, is going to be a significant, increase significantly going forward.
Thanks, Mauro. We have a couple more minutes. Perhaps if you and Hadija Shyamala, if you would like to give some concluding remarks, maybe talk a little bit more about some of the lessons that have been learned so far. Some of our participants have been asking about the structure seems great, but the implementation seems to be challenging. So perhaps you can talk about some of the lessons that you've seen and you've already experienced and conclude the webinar.
I recall during the development of the management framework when we were working closely with Shamla, it was a quite ingenious idea and we were so excited to get it rolled out and we were like, this will work, all this complex will just get it working around. But as like Shamla mentioned, the key challenge that PDMO in particular has faced in trying to implement and operationalize the FCCL management framework has been around the technical capacity required to actually roll it out. And one thing that we sort of created as an avenue of a fixture to it is that the first stage of FCCL assessment is feasibility stage. And we, within the PPP Act, what the Kenya's PPP Act provides is let's engage expertise in actually doing that due diligence, transaction advisors, qualified and experienced transaction advisors. Within their terms of reference, then we were able to sort of input the fact that FCCL assessment on both the contingent liabilities would be an upfront exercise by them to support the government of Kenya. What the PDMO's role would then be is reviewing that assessment as regards them having the actual know-how of how the government's books look like, sort of to validate that this assessment is correct and then pass it on to the PPP committee for approval. So that was an interim measure, but still something that we can continue carrying on as we perfect this practice. So that particular challenge would have been a deal breaker to the FCCL management framework, but because we were able to find a system where let's put it on the obligation of our transaction advisors that they go around and they will calculate data on the risk allocation framework, try to see past projects of a similar structure of PPP in African context, in similar environments, and try to quantify, would this risk in this particular setting have the same sort of probability? And if it does, what would be the quantum of it happening? Then replicating that in a project in Kenya. Using that expertise, then working closely with the FCCL unit at the PDMO, their capacity is built in practice, so that when it comes to their actual evaluation and review of it, they have the inherent characteristics to sort of say, wait a minute, this could be right, this could be wrong. So I think that was a challenge that we can say is still sort of growing, but then we are finding innovative ways of going around. Would you say there's something else that is plaguing the PDMO?
Plaguing is a good one. Yeah, I think it's all been said really. What I'd like to just maybe to reinforce what Hadija has said is that ultimately it's a new language. We're teaching a new language to by shifting the paradigm around how risk is managed. And I think more than any other key, I think I'd say the one legacy of the FCCL process in Kenya has been really bringing to the forefront a risk-based approach to decision making. That I think is a great legacy, and one that, if for no other reason, I think I would encourage any government to do, because it means across government now, whenever whenever, for example, I said I've exposed anyone to the project risk matrix, first question I always got from the senior government officials, why don't we do this for other things? So in terms of a legacy, I think it has been a very key catalyst to that conversation, which is needful in these days of financial, very sensitive financial environments that we live in. Thank you.
Shyamala, over to you.
That's about it. I think we have, summed up the challenges, and we are still, just for the knowledge of the participants, we are still looking at, the same models which we tried to implement in the case of Kenya. These are just the valuation, which is a small part, but an important part of the FCCL management framework. We're still trying to work on those, and hopefully we will get somewhere. We also have a few other countries in sub-Saharan Africa who are on board or looking at institutional structures right now, like Kenya did initially. And we'll all come to that point where the valuation becomes a challenge, and to get it done in-house becomes a greater challenge. And we will have to continue to depend on transaction advisors for a while, but hopefully very soon we will have answers for that as we work together with governments.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wohoro, Hadija, Shyamala, for this very informative conversation. Thank the audience for listening in today. I would like to ask you, like every time, to please fill out the feedback form. It should be available on your screens shortly. The recording also of this webinar will be available 24 hours from now. The next webinar is on of this series is on October 4th on institutional quality and impact on PPP implementation in Kenya. We'll have Shyamala again as a discussant and Dr. Rono discussing this topic. Thank you very much for joining, and we hope we'll see you again soon.